Hello friends, welcome to another video tutorial on the Code Angle YouTube channel. In today's video, we'll be creating a crash course by making use of Firebase 9 as well as React to create a task manager application. So quickly, let me show you a demo of what we're going to build today. As you can see on the page, we have a list of tasks which contains different buttons to add a new task, to delete a task, as well as to edit a specific task. Also, we have a checkbox beside each of the tasks. So the first thing I'm going to do is to click on this checkbox and then refresh the page, and you see that the checkbox that was clicked gets persisted because we are handling that in the database. So anytime we click on a checkbox and the checkbox strikes through that particular data, it shows that that data has been completed. And then we can also add a new task. So if I click on add task, a modal pops up and I can type in probably learn Angular and click on create task. Then the newly created task will be added to the list of tasks in the database. And to test out the edit task, probably you are only interested in React and you are not interested in Angular, so you just click on edit task and then probably you type in learn the context API and then click on update tags, and then you see that the tags, that specific tags, gets updated in the database, as you can see in the front end here. And you can see that each particular task has a time assigned to it in which the task was created. So probably you are no longer interested in learning the context API and you want to delete that particular task. You can just click on delete task and then an alert pop-up shows up asking you, are you sure you want to delete this task? And then if you click on OK, that particular task gets deleted and removed from the database. So as you can see, that's all we'll be building today. If you are new to this channel, please make sure you like as well as subscribe so as to make the YouTube algorithm recommend my videos to other developers out there. And without wasting much time, let's get straight into the action. So the first thing we're going to do is to set up our Firebase backend by making use of the Firestore. To do that, we head straight to firebase.google.com. I'm already on that page. You can sign in with your Google account. The next thing, you click on go to console, and then on the console page we can now create a new project from there. And for this project, I'm going to call the project name Tasker, similar to what we are trying to build, and then I can click on the checkbox and click on continue. We don't need Google Analytics, so I'm going to disable that and then click on create project. Then with that, Firebase will create a new project for us. And once the new project has been created, we can click on the continue button and then we'll get navigated to the Firebase dashboard. And on this dashboard, what we need to do is to click on the build drop down, and then we see different options we can click on. What we need is the Firestore database, so I'm going to click on that. And in the Firestore database, we can configure our database from here by clicking on this create database button. So for this application, we'll start with the test mode. We are not putting the app in production, so I can select that and then click on next. Then we get asked to select the Cloud Firestore location. Ideally, you want to select a location that is closer to your region for latency, but I'm gonna just stay with the default one which was selected for us, and then click on enable, and then it's going to start provisioning the Cloud Firestore. And once the setup is completed, we get navigated to where we can start setting up our collection. I'm gonna just close this particular option and dismiss this one to stop any form of distraction. So I'm gonna start by clicking on this start collection, and then we need to assign a name to our collection. I'm gonna call it tasks because this collection is going to contain all the tasks we are going to create. So I click on next. Then the next thing is we need to set up the documents which will be required for each field. For the first field, I think we're gonna need two fields here. One is the tax, and then the second one is the checkbox field, which is checked. We'll name that is checked. So I'm gonna type out task, and then it's gonna be a type of string. You see over here we have so many data types for the document, but I'm gonna stick with string, and then the value could just be learn SQL, or probably let's just say learn React since we are doing a React project. And then we can auto generate an ID, and once that is done, we can then click on, we can add another field. So the next field is going to be called is checked. I didn't spell that correctly. So this checked is going to be a data type of boolean, because it's going to be either true or false, because it's going to be a checkbox, and by default we're going to have it as false. So with that, we have the two fields we need for this document, and I can click on save, and you can see this particular document has two fields, the checked field as well as the task field. Probably we need to add another document, so I'm going to click on add document, and then this one is going to be also task, and then is a string, and I can say learn redux. So we add another field, and this field is going to be called is checked, just like we did previously, and it's going to be a boolean as well, because it's a checkbox. And then we're going to click on auto id, and an id will be automatically generated for us, and then we can click on save. And with that, I think all we need to do in our cloud Firestore is complete. And later on in the project, in our React project, what we're going to do is to try to read every document in this database and display it on the page, and also try to manipulate it. But that will be a little while in the project. But for now, that's all we need to do in our cloud Firestore. So we can now move on to the next step, which is to create a new React project. To create a new React project, what we need to do is to head straight to the directory we want your React app to be created, which I've already done, as you can see on the screen. And we'll be making use of create React app to do this. So I'm going to head straight to the create-react-app.dev website, and in there I'll click on the get started button, and then I scroll down, and then I copy this particular npm command, and then I head straight to my terminal, I paste it in, and then you can see the command which says npm init react-app, and then the name of the app. So I'm going to call this app react-tags, and then I'm going to press enter. So this is going to generate a boilerplate code for us. Now that the create React app has completed the boilerplate generation, we can just move into that particular directory by typing cd-task and then pressing enter. Then I'm going to open it in Visual Studio Code. And as you can see, we have various folders in this project. We have the src folder, we have the public folders, and we have the node modules. But there are a lot of files we don't need, which are already in this project. So I'm just going to quickly do a cleanup of this project. So I'm going to delete some of the files. So as you can see, all the files we don't need has been deleted. So I'm just going to head straight to the app.js file, and then I'm going to do a cleanup here as well. So I'm going to remove this import logo, and then I'm going to get rid of everything inside of this return, apart from the div wrapper that has the class name of app. And then in the index.js file, I'm going to get rid of this as well. And in the index.html file, in the public directory, we might need to get rid of the manifest.json link tag. I think that's all. Then I can save and then run npm start, and let's see how the project looks in the browser. So we have an error somewhere that says the web vitals is imported in one of the files, but it doesn't exist. I think that is in the index.js file. So I'm going to get rid of that. And then let's save again. I believe we should have gotten rid of all the errors. So to be sure that our React app is going to load properly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to head straight to the app.js file, and then I'm going to type in an h1 tag and say hello world, and then save. Let's see if this displays on the browser. Yeah, so perfect. Now we've been able to clean up our React projects, and then we can now start setting up the code structure for this project. So I'm going to start by heading to the src directory, and then inside of the src directory, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it components. It's going to contain all the components we need for this project, and we'll just need two components actually. The first component is going to be called task.js, and the second component we'll call that edit task.js and .js, and then press enter. So we can just generate a boilerplate here by typing refce and then press enter. And the same thing can be done for the task.js, and then we press enter as well. And also for the Firebase service, we need a folder for that as well, and that means in our src directory I'm going to create a new folder as well, and I'm going to call that services, and press enter. Inside of the services folder, I'm going to have a file called firebase.config.js. This is where we have the configuration for our Firebase. But before we set that up, we need to install Firebase inside of this project because we don't have Firebase installed. So to do that, I'm just going to run npm install Firebase, and with that, Firebase 9 is going to get installed in this project. And while the installation is going on, I'm going to head straight to the Firebase dashboard. Once again, I need to get the project settings. So to do that, I'm going to click on project overview, click on these settings right here, and then we get navigated to the page where we are able to get the settings, and we are presented with these three icons: the iOS, the Android icon here, as well as the web icon. We are building a web application, so I'm going to select the web icon we have right here, and then it asks us to give our app a nickname. You can just type in a random name. I'm just going to call it Task as well, and then click on register app. After that, the project configuration settings will be generated, which we can see down below. So what we need is just this configuration, which contains the API key, the auth domain, project IDs, the storage bucket, the messaging sender ID, as well as the app ID. So what I'm going to do right here is I'm just going to grab everything we have here. I'm going to copy it, head straight to the Firebase config. Let me close these other files we have right here and just focus on the Firebase config. So I'm just going to paste it, and I'm going to bring it down a little bit, and I'm just going to give it a var. And so because Firebase 9 is modular in nature, like by default, so I just need to bring in two different Firebase functions, which are initialize app and get Firestore. To do that, I need to import them. So I'm going to type in import initialize app from Firebase/app, and then we're going to do the same thing for get Firestore. So I'm going to type in import get Firestore, and we're getting that from Firebase/Firestore. So these two functions would enable us to export our database to different parts of our project. Any components we need to use our project in, it allows us to export it to that particular component. So what we can do next is just to initialize Firebase by typing in const app is equals to initialize app, which we declared right above, and then we're going to pass in the Firebase config object we copied from our project dashboard, and then we can now export it by typing in export const db is equals to get Firestore, and then we pass in the app. So with this, when we import the app in any of our components, that is the edit or the tags components, we'll be able to have Firebase initialize in any one of them. Now, before we move to the next step of this crash course, I want to confirm if Firebase has been installed. I'm going to head straight to the terminal, and as you can see, Firebase has been installed. And let me confirm this in the package.json file, and we can see right here Firebase 9.10 is now in our package.json. That means we have access to it anywhere in our application. So what I want to do next is to set up the design for each of these components, the edit tags components, as well as the tags.js component. So for this project, we'll be making use of Bootstrap 5. So what I'm going to quickly do is to head straight to the get Bootstrap documentation. So I'm going to grab the CDN for the CSS as well as the CDN for the JS. So I'm going to head straight to the public directory, and inside of the index.html, I'm going to paste them right here. So the first one I'm going to paste is going to be the CDN for the CSS, then followed by the CDN for the JS script. So I'm going to save, and with that we have access to Bootstrap anywhere in this project. Now we can start by designing the tags component. So to do that, I'll need to head straight to the app.js file. I want to import the tags component right here, so I'm just gonna import it right here. So I'm gonna save, and then let's run the terminal once more by running the command npm start. So while that is compiling, we can start by generating the needed divs would need to design this page. So the first div we're going to create is the fragment, an empty fragment. Like this serves as a wrapper, helps us to avoid a lot of errors in React. And then under this, within this div, then I can create a container div. So I'm just going to say dot container. If you are familiar with Bootstrap, you know this is a Bootstrap class. Another div we need is the row div. We also need the column MD of 12, as well as we need the card div. So I'm going to give this a card, and the card color is going to be white. So I'm going to say dot card dash white. And the last div we need is the card body. So I'm just going to do card dash body, and with that I can just press enter, and all these divs get generated for us. And within this div we can have the structure of our page, but let me just put a random tag here by saying hello world once more. Let's see how it looks, and then let's save and let's check the browser. As you can see, hello world gets displayed, and you can see this container showing around the hello world text. So to continue our design, what we need to do is to create the body for the tags, and each tag is going to have a checkbox assigned to it. So once again, we need a div for that. So the first div is going to have a class called to do dash list. This is not a Bootstrap class, so we need to design this in the index.css later on. So the second div right under it is going to be called to do dash item, and then we press enter. Okay, I think there's a mistake. We didn't put the full stop right in front of it, so it doesn't know it's a div. And yeah, you can see we have the two divs right there, and right below it we're going to have an HR tag which serves as a demarcation for each of the tags. And then right below the HR we're going to have a span, and within this span we're going to have another div which is going to be called checker. So inside this div we have another span, and this span is going to contain our input tag. So I'm going to type in input, and it's going to be a type of checkbox. And then right below this div we have right here, I'm going to create a tax name. Probably let's give this a name of create, or no, let's say learn web dev. So learn web dev, that will be the tax we create. We just need to create one tax for now. And below the span we can just create an edit and a delete button. So in Bootstrap I can just type in button, and then the button tag gets created. I can just say edit task, and then we're gonna give it a class. So for now I can just give it a class of, first let's give it a type of button, and then a class name of btn dash, you can give it a btn of primary for now. And the same thing would be done for the delete tags. So that would be btn danger. That's read in Bootstrap 5, so it's danger, not danger. So I'm gonna say delete task, and instead of saying tags, let's just say delete. I'm gonna get rid of this tags, and then let's save and see how the page looks for now. Okay, not looking very pretty, right? So we need to add the CSS pretty soon. In fact, I think we should do that now. So I'm gonna head straight to the index.css file, and within the index.css file I'm gonna get rid of this code we have right here, and then I'm gonna get rid of everything within the body. And then in the body I can just start by giving a margin dash top, because I see everything is stacked to the top. I can just give it 20 px, and then below it I can give it a background of f8 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 f8. So the next class we want to style is the to-do list. So to-do dash list. So I'm gonna give it a style of margin 10 px and then 0 right there. And then let's move to the next. So the next one is the to-do dash lists as well as the to-do dash item. So to-do dash item, and then within the to-do dash list and item, I'm gonna give them a padding. So it's gonna have a padding of 15 px, and then right under it you can give it a margin, not margin top, just a margin. Margin top is 5 px actually, and then we're gonna give the rest of them 0, and then the border radius is gonna be 0. So border radius 0, and then let's move on to the next style, or the next class name we want to style. So that will be the div dash checker. So I'm just gonna be div dash checker. I think that's where we have our input field, and then I'm gonna call the input tag right there. So we can give them a width of 18 px, and the height is gonna also be 18 px for some consistency. And then finally we want to style the div that checker. So I can just say display inline dash block, and then right under it we can give it a vertical align. I'm gonna set it to the middle, and then we also style the width as well. I'm gonna give it a width of 18 px, and finally I'm gonna give this an height, if you can guess it, of also 18 px. So let's see how this looks after we save it. Doesn't look as expected. I think let me check the code. Okay, probably the app.css is affecting some of what we have on the page, so I'm just gonna clear everything we have in the app.css. You might as well just delete it. So probably everything should look better now. Yes, so as you can see, everything is now looking much better and aligned to the left, just like we have it in the sample. So we just need to make some final editing by taking the buttons to the right. As you can see, the buttons are stacked to the left, very close to the text. We don't want that, so let me just close the rest of the files and just leave the task.js components, since that's what we're working with. So I'm just gonna give it a class name, not a class name really. So I'm just gonna say, okay, you know what, let's give it a class name of float end dash end. This is a bootstrap class, and then mx-3. So let's save, and then let's see how the buttons look. So this needs to be applied to both buttons. In fact, what we can do is I'm gonna open a span right here, and then this span is gonna take in that particular class. I'm gonna cut this button and then put it within this span, and then this span is gonna have a class name of float end and mx-3, which are bootstrap 5 classes. Takes the buttons to the end of the page. So let's save, and then we can give this btn danger float end as well. So I'm just gonna copy this float end, and then after the btn danger, and then add it to it, and then save. So the page looks much better, but I think the checkbox and the text are too close to each other, so I can just add an HTML character for space. So to do that, I'm just going to head straight to where we have learn web dev, and I'm going to call the ampersand and say mbsp, and then add a colon right after it, and then save. I think that should add the space we require. Yes, you can see there's now a space. So with that, I think we're done for the design for the task components. So I think we can now move on to the next step in this project. So the next step in this project is to integrate the Firebase functions that allows us to read, update, create, and delete data from the database. And to start with that, we need to bring in the Firebase configuration settings right inside of this project. So I'm just going to import the DB. We called it DB in the Firebase settings. So I'm just going to say from, I think we're bringing it from services. Yes, services forward slash firebase.config. Now we can now configure our collection right here. So the collection allows us to access the particular collection we created when we're doing the setup in the Firebase dashboard. So to do that, I can just say const collection ref is equals to collection, which we need to import from Firebase Firestore. As you can see above, we now have the collection imported. I want that to be below the importation of React. So I'm just going to say collection, and collection takes in two arguments. So the first one is a DB, which is the configuration settings for the Firebase, and the second one is the name of the database, that the name of the document we created. And if I head back to the Firebase dashboard, let me quickly show you inside of the Firebase Firestore database rather. If you look at the collection, it's called tax with an S, so I need to reference that. It has to be the same, so I can say tax. So that means anytime we want to query the database, it's going to query this particular collection we have right there. So what we want to do is to read the data first, that is display all the data we have in the database on the page. So to do that, I'm going to bring in use effects from Firebase, from React rather. So I'm going to say use effects, and we'll need use state as well. Let me also make use of use state, but probably we don't need it for now, but let me still bring it in because we're going to need it immediately after we configure reading the data from database by making use of use effects. So let's set up the use effects first. So we say use effects takes in an arrow function, and then yeah, usually there's a dependency injection at the end of the use effect. So I'm just gonna do that. The empty bracket serves as a form of dependency injection. So to get started, this is gonna be an asynchronous request. So I'm gonna create a function called in lowercase. I'm gonna create a function called get tags. So I'm gonna say get tags because we want to get all the tags from the database, and we're making use of async await. So I'm just gonna say async, and then inside the async function we can now make use of the Firebase function that allows us to get data from the Firebase database. So to do that, I'm just going to type in await get docs. That is the document that allows us to read from the database, so we need to import that as well. So as you can see, it's already imported from the Firebase Firestore. So get docs is going to take in the collection reference. So I'm going to say collection reference, which we created right above. You can see here, that's the collection reference. So the collection reference, then it returns a promise, and we need to make use of .then. And so I'm going to say .then, and then I'm going to create a variable here that say task. So I need to look through the task. So I can just say task doc map, and then we also need the doc. So inside of the doc, let's probably let's console log the doc, and let's see what we have on the console. So console.log doc. So let me save. We need to call the function for it to work, so we need to call this get tags. So we call that right below here. So get tags. So with that, function gets rendered inside of the use effects when the page loads. So I'm going to head straight to the browser, and in our projects, ensure that the page properly refreshes, and then I'm going to inspect the console, and then we have an error that says tags.docChanges.map is not a function on tags 12. So we made an error somewhere. Oh, I think this is predictive text or something. So it's not tags.docChange, rather it's tags.docs, in fact, with an S. So I think that should solve that error. So let me refresh once again. As you can see, we get a bunch of objects from the database, which means what we are doing is correct. So if I open the Firestore we have right here, we can see different options available to us, like the Firestore clients, the app check credential, the alt credentials, and the likes. But what we really need, we still need to extract from one of these objects from the document. So to do that, I'm going to head straight to the project, and I'm going to set a variable right inside of this await. So let's call this let tax data. So let tax data is equals to tax.docs.map and likes. So instead of console.log, let's have something right here. So I'm gonna extract the objects that we need. So the first thing we need is the data, and the second one we need is the ID. So to extract the data, what I'm going to do is to make use of the spread operator. So to copy the object, so doc.data, it's gonna have a bracket, and then beside it, the second argument we have is the ID, and the ID is what? doc.id. So with that, we have access to the data as well as the ID. But to see it in the console, to see that this exists in the console, what I want to do is to make use of the use states, and the use states is going to be used to get the tags that we just try to access from the database. That is this tags we have right here. So to do that, I'm just going to make use of the const variable declarator in JavaScript, and then say task with an S, and then say set tags, and then it's going to be equals to use state, and the default state is going to be an empty array. So we now head back to let's docs. We head back to our use effects rather, and below the tax data variable, I can just paste in the set tax and then pass in the tax data. As you can see right there, now we can now log this tax to the console and see how it looks. Probably it's going to be in the format we expect. Tax save. So let me refresh the page. So as you can see, by default it loads an empty bracket, then we get the two data we saved in the Firebase database. You can see here the learn redux as well as learn react. We have them here, learn redux, learn react. So that's awesome. So as you can see, we've been able to read from the database. So what I want to do next is to try to loop through that set of tags and display it. Instead of having this static text we have right here, let's have a dynamic data. So to do that, I'm going to head straight to the JSX, and this is going to happen within the to-do list tag which we have right here. Let me just bring this down so to be sure we are on the right section. So I'm just gonna say tags. Since it's an array, I'm gonna make use of the array method of map, and then because we want to extract the data, so the data inside of the tags are what? The first one is the task. Let's check once more. The first one is the task, which is right here, and the second one is the ID. We don't need the is checked value for now, so I just want to extract the task and the ID. So I'm just gonna say task and ID. Now that that has been extracted, we can now cut this part out and then make use of the arrow function, or the arrow rather, and then paste the closing bracket right there. So as you can see, we can now clear this learn web dev, and instead what we have there is what? The task. And then what next? We need to pass in the ID, because React wants to track the amount of data which renders on the page. We need to make use of the key attribute. So I'm just going to pass in the ID right there. So I'm going to save, and let's see if we have the dynamic data now loading on the page. Yes, fantastic. The data now loads. As you can see, we have learn react as well as learn redux. So with that, we've been able to successfully read data and display it on the page in the browser from the Firestore database. So with that, we can now move to the next stage of this project. So what I want us to do next is to be able to add data to the database right from our code. So to do that, we'll need to make use of a Bootstrap 5 modal. So what I'm going to do is to head straight to the Bootstrap documentation once again, and then type or search for modal, and then let's select a modal from Bootstrap 5. So I think I'm gonna make use of this particular modal right here. So the first thing I need to do is to grab this particular div tag. We have the modal body we have right here, so I'm gonna paste it at the end of the page, or at the end of the JSX we have right here, and this is gonna be this is now we comment in JSX. So I'm just gonna add a comment right there, and the class is supposed to be class name, not class. So according to JSS, we make use of class name, and then we need the modal button. This helps us to trigger the modal, so I'm just going to grab the modal button as well, and then scroll just right above this task loop we have right here. So I can just paste in right in. Once again, we're gonna change the comment style since this is JSX, and then change the class from class to class name, and then let us save, and let's see if the modal gets triggered in our project. So let's click on launch demo modal. As you can see, the modal gets triggered. So we're going to make a little bit of edits to this. So the first thing we need to do is to change this from launch modal demo modal to add task. So I'm just going to say add task. And then in the modal body, we need to make some little configurations right here. So the first thing we need to do is within the modal, we have a modal body section, and what we need here is a form. So I'm just going to create a form, just a form tag. We don't need an action since we have our own way of submitting data to the Firebase database. It doesn't need an action to do that. So within the form, we have a class name of d-flex, and then we can also create an input tag which has a type of text as well as a class name or form control, and then finally a placeholder that says add a task. So let me save that, and then let's see how it looks this time around. Yes, this is more feasible, so we can always click on save changes to add a new task. So the modal, we can make further configuration. Instead of having, what actually triggers the modal is this ID which you have here, which is the example modal. If you search for example modal, and it's also being initialized with the database targets in the button tag, so we can change this from example modal to add tasks. Let me just say add task. So let's save. So this is much more appropriate. It helps whoever is new to this code base to understand some of the namings in the code. So let's see if this works properly. Yeah, it still works. Or let me refresh to ensure that is the case. Yeah, it still works. So we have React warning us here that says tab index is supposed to be capital I. So let me search for tab index somewhere right here. Tab index. So let's change this from small letter or lowercase to uppercase. So let's save. So now we can now start integrating Firebase into this project that enables us to add data to the database. So to do that, we're going to create a function, and let me just give this a comment that says add task handler. So within the add task handler, I can just create a function that says submit task. This helps us to add the task, and it's going to be asynchronous. So because of the asynchronous nature, we're going to make use of the try and catch. So I'm going to make use of the try catch block. So try catch. So we can always console log the error anytime we have an error. And also within these use effects we have here, I can also add a catch here and add an error, and then we can also, oh sorry, I didn't do that properly. So it's supposed to be catch error, so we can always console log the error. This is for reading the task. Probably we didn't get the task properly. So we can make use of the click event handler in the form tag we have in our modal. So I'm just going to say on click event handler. So we just give it the submit task we just created, and then we can now head straight to where we have our function initialized. So the first thing I want to do is to prevent defaults, because the default behavior of a form is to reload the page after submitting. So I can just say e.prevent defaults, and then within the try block I can just say await, and this is where we need to make use of a function in the Firestore that allows us to add to the database. So the function that does this is called add doc, because we're adding just a single document. So if you check right above, it's automatically imported for us, which is add doc. So the add doc is gonna take in some parameters. So the first one is called the collection ref, which allows the add doc to know which collection is trying to add the data to. And then the next one is an object. So the objects it wants to add to the database, the first one is going to be the tax, and then the second one is going to be the is checked, because when you check the database, those are the two items or the two fields we have. So the tax. So before we proceed, we need to get the values for the tax. So to do that, we need to make use of the onChange event handler. So when I scroll down to the form, in the input field, we have the input type of text. So probably let me just bring this down, which allows it easier to read for us. So I'm gonna bring this down a little bit. So I'm gonna call the onChange event handler, and then I'm gonna pass in e. Then we need to create a setter for this, but since I haven't done that, let me just quickly create that here. So I'm gonna just say set create tax. Set create tax is gonna have e dot target of value, allows us to get the event dot target of value. So right above, I can just say right here const set create tax. The first one is going to be the create tax, and then we have a comma, then make use of the then make use of the use state. And it's gonna be empty by default. So we can always console log the create tax to ensure we're having the proper values in the console. But for now, to test it, I'm just gonna comment out this try catch block, and then just say console.log create tax. So let me save, and then let's see if the values we have on the form gets loaded in the console. So let me click on add tax, and then let's type this is it, and then let me clear the console, and then click on save changes. For some reason, the save changes is not logging the text into the what's it called, into the console. Let's check what the error could be. So I'm gonna scroll down to where the modal is, and I can see the form is probably not wrapped around the buttons. The forms is supposed to wrap around the buttons we have right here. So that's our mistake. So it needs to be higher up, probably somewhere around where we have the modal contents, probably above it. So I'm gonna cut this form tag, the opening tag for the form, and then wrap it around. Hold on, wrap it around here. Okay, that should do it. I think that should do it. So let me bring this a little bit closer to each other. So let me save, and this time around, I'm sure when we click on the save changes, it should lock the values in the fields to the console. So I click on the add tags button once more, and then type some random characters and click on save changes. As you can see, we now have the value in the console, which we can now send to the database. So quickly I head straight to the top of the page, and then I uncomment the try catch block, and then within the await, we have the second parameter after the collection ref. So the first one is the tax. The tax is gonna take in the value of the form, which is the create tax. We just log to the console, and then the is checked value, which we're gonna implement later. But for now, every value is going to be false by default. So I'm gonna save, and then we'll try to send data to the database, and let's see if it's going to work. So I click on add tags, then I say learn the context API, and then I click on save changes. Instead of save changes, probably we should have something else. We should have add tags, add task. Anyways, let's see if this one has already been saved into the database. As you can see, it has. We have learned the context API, so it already exists. So let me save again, but before we proceed, I want to refresh the page if the data sent successfully by typing in window.location.reload. So let's save and refresh the page. I think this should be the final step. So as you can see, we've managed to save an empty task into the database. I guess we're gonna delete that later. And then we can validate the field later by probably disabling the button if the field is empty. This will help us to prevent the empty state. Wait, what's going on? I think we have an issue somewhere. Anytime we click on the add task, the form sort of reloads. Oh, this is supposed to be on submit instead of on click. So we have on submit. That's why anytime we refresh we click on the form, the attacks, the functions fires off and then an empty field gets saved to the database. So what I'm going to do is to clear every empty field we have right here. I can just delete the document for that and then search for another one that has an empty document. So delete that particular document and then I think this is the last one. So delete this document and then let's refresh the page. That's kind of weird. Okay, there's one more. Let's delete this, delete the document, and then let's refresh the page. Yeah, cool. So let's click on the attacks. So let's say learn the context API. And then click on attacks. Okay, for some weird reason the form is not submitting. Let's inspect once more. Work with this B. Okay, we have the unsubmit and we have the function for the unsubmit, the unchange event handler. Okay, the button type, I think yes, I think the button type is supposed to be submit, not button, submit. So let me save and then let the page refresh. Hopefully this time around it works. So let's click on the attacks once more and then type in learn the context API and click on attacks. As you can see, the form submits this time around and then the new tags gets added to the list of tags. So we've been able to implement two things right now. We've been able to read data from the database and we've been able to add tags to the database. So the next thing to do is to work on how to delete data from the database. So to delete a specific task, let me get rid of this console log we have right here and we're going to create a new function and we're going to call it delete tags. And then it's gonna be asynchronous function. We're gonna make use of the try catch. So make use of try catch block, not spelling catch properly. So what we have here is the error, and then we can always console log or alert the error, whatever way you want it to be. It's fine. We didn't spell async properly. It's supposed to be a sync. C is supposed to be at the end. All right, so the first thing I want to do is to create a window.confirm to be sure we want to delete that particular task. So window.confirm is going to ask us anytime we click on this delete task function, are you sure you want to delete this task? Then if you be presented with a prompt, if you select no, it won't delete the task. If you select yes, the task gets deleted. So what we want to do now is right where we have the delete in the JSX, the delete button in the JSX. So to make this much more readable, I'm just gonna bring this down a little bit. The class name, let's bring this closer to it, and then we're gonna create an on-click event handler. And this on-click event handler is going to have a delete task which we created right above, and it's going to take in a argument which is id. So the id, if you are wondering, is gotten from the tags array which we destructured right here. So we passed it into this delete tag, so we can always access it in our function. So in case you are wondering, if I console log the id by saving everything we have here, you see that we have the id in the console. So if I clear the console and I click on delete, and we get presented with a prompt that says, are you sure you want to delete this task? If I say okay, you can see the id gets logged in the console. The same thing for this second task, all the ids get logged into the console. So now we can work with the Firebase function that helps us to delete a task. To do that, we can make use of the await keyword and then call delete doc. This is the function that allows us to delete a document in Firebase, which we've imported right above. Then before we proceed, the delete doc takes in a document reference. So the document reference is slightly different from the collection reference because it takes in an ID apart from the DB and the tax, the collection name. So we can just separately create a variable that says document ref. So document ref is equals to, then we'll make use of the doc, which I'm not sure we've imported. Oh no. So we'll make use of the doc, which we just imported. If we check above, we now have the doc, which is here. So I'm gonna scroll down once again. So inside of the doc, it takes in 3 arguments. The first one is DB, the second one is the collection name, which is the tasks we have in the database, and lastly the ID. So we need to pass the document ref to the delete doc function, and then if the function deletes successfully, we want to reload the page. So window dot location dot reload, and then we save. So let me get rid of this console log ID. So let's save and then make sure the page refreshes properly, and let's delete the most recent tags we created, which is learn the context API. So I'm going to click on that, and it asks me if I'm sure I want to delete these tags, and I say okay, and then let's see if the tags get deleted. As you can see, the task has been deleted. Let's say I want to delete this learn redux, and then I say cancel instead of okay, it doesn't get deleted. So now we are done with the deleting of documents from the database. As you can see, we just have 2 items now in database. Now we can now work on the updating of documents by using the edit button to update a document. So that's the next thing we want to do now. So to edit a task, I'm going to be implementing the functionality in the edit task component. So instead of having everything in the task.js file, we need to create a separation of concern. So the data is going to be passed as props. So instead of having this edit button right here, so what we can have is the edit component, edit task component. So what I can do is I'm just going to clear everything in the all the button, and then we're going to have edit task, and then we're going to import it right into this component. If I save and then I head straight to the page, we'll no longer see a button, rather we'll see what we have in the edit task, which is just this div which says edit task. So the edit task is going to be just a modal, nothing more, nothing less. So because it's a modal, we can just easily copy the modal we have in our modal right here. So I'm just going to grab everything we have right here. So I'm going to copy it s to the edit task modal, and I'm going to create an empty fragment first, and then I'm just going to paste the modal. Let me grab the comment as well, so we'll know it's a modal for those that would have access to this in Git, so they'll be able to read the code properly. We also need the button for the modal, so I'm just going to grab the button. So let's quickly make the changes we need to make. So instead of add task, it's going to be update task, and instead of add task right here, you can just have update task. So I'm gonna save, and then hopefully when we click on the the form we have right here, there's nothing like on submit tags, and also the unchanged, none of such exists. We haven't created the variables for them, so that's why we have that error. So I'm gonna save once more and refresh the page properly, and if I click on update tags, you can see we now have a modal pop-up. So it says add a tags. We can edit the button right there by saying update tags instead, because we're updating. And also I noticed the modal title, so instead of having modal title, we can just say update tags, and then in the tags component as well, instead of having modal title here as well, we can just say add tags. So let's save everything we've done and then head back to the edit tags components. So cool. So quickly to begin, I'll need to pass the props for the data we have in the task component to the edit tags component. So what do I mean by this? So we need 2 things. We need the tags, and then we need the ID. So I'm just going to pass in this tags by saying tags equals to task, and same thing with the ID. ID is equals to ID. So we can now extract this in our edit task components by opening a bracket and then saying task and then id, and then we can now do a console log of the task and the id to be sure we have access to this. Let's save everything we've done. As you can see in the edit tags on line 5, we have learn redux and the id, learn react and the id, all in line 5, which we have right here. So now we now have access to the data, so we can now make an edit functionality in this project. So to begin with, the first thing we need to bring in is the use state hook in React. So it's gonna be inside of a bracket. I didn't spell that out properly. Use states, and then we need to bring in the db as well. So I'm gonna import the db is the configuration in our service. So from services, and then it's gonna be called Firebase config. Cool. So now we need to make use of the setter and the getter in use state. So I'm just gonna say const updated tags set updated tags, and then by default equals to use state. So by default it's going to have the tax data we are getting from our tax components right here. So we said that, so our update tax has that by default. This allows us to prefill the form based on whichever one we click. So what we want to do next is quickly head to the form in the modal. So in the input field, the first thing we want to configure is the default value. So the default value is going to be the updated tax. Then next up, we need to make use of the onChange event handler. So the onChange is going to be the set updated tax, which is going to take in the value of the form event.target.value, the newly created values like typed into the form field. So the way we can now update the form is by creating a function called update tax, not updated tax. This function is going to be called update tax. So there's a difference between updated and update. So update tax is going to be asynchronous, just like we've done so many times in this project. So instead of tax, this is going to be e and e.prevent defaults. I'm not sure if this is necessary because we're going to be having this in our button, not on the form. So right in the button is going to be a click event handler, the update tax. So just going to bring this down. It's going to be on click, it's equals to update tax, and then I'm going to have the events as well. The events, okay, so it's gonna have an arrow somewhere here. So cool. So within the update tags, in fact for now, let's see if we have the values of the form pre-filled in the input field when we click on the update tags. So I've already saved. Let me refresh. So let's click on this learn redux. Okay, probably it doesn't show. I think probably we didn't set it up properly. Okay, this updated tax was not called, so I'm gonna grab that. What we have in the default value is update tax. That's wrong. It's supposed to be updated tax. So once again, I save, I refresh, and then I click on update tax. As you can see, learn redux is right here and we can edit it. And I close. If I click on update tax, if you notice one thing, what we typed last in this field gets shown in the next field, like learn redux and learn react. I think I know the problem for that. This is because the id for the field is the same, so it's loading the same modal for both fields. So the id needs to be dynamic. But before we tackle that issue, I want us to integrate the update tax functionality first. So let's create a try catch block. So try catch, let's console log the error in case there is an error. So the first thing we need to do is to create a tax document. So I'm gonna create a just similar to what we did in delete. So the tax document is going to take in the doc objects, which we need to bring in from Firebase Firestore, and then it's going to take in 3 parameters. The first one is the db, the second one is the collection name, and the third one is the ID, which we import from the props in the task component. So perfect, we've been able to set up our task component. Now we can now make use of the await keyword and then use the update doc function from Firebase to update the specific document we want to update. So let's import that from Firebase Firestore, which you can see right above. I prefer this being below the React and the use state. So I can just say update doc, which is also going to take in its own parameters. The first thing we pass in is the task document we create above, and then it's going to take in an object. So the object is the newly created fields we have. So the first one is from the database. The key is tasks, not tasks. If we check the database, so this, if I click on this, you see it's task without the s, and then the task is going to be updated task. That's what we're going to pass in because that's the value of the form. And then the second one is this checked boolean, which is all we always set this to false for now. We'll make it dynamic later. And then with that, we can save, and let's see if we're able to update the task. So let's update learn redux to learn redux API, and then click on update task. In fact, just like we've done previously, if it's successful, I want the window.location.reload to fire off once it's saved to the database. So I'm going to refresh once more. So I click on updated task. So I say learn redux API, click on update task, and let's see. As you can see, the database has now changed. It's now learn redux API, which we have right here. And like I said, the issue here is anytime you want to update a task and you click on if one of the modals is going to be one modal that will be displaying. So you can see learn redux API still shows, instead of learn react, we have learn redux API. So we need to make the ID dynamic, and that's just very simple. So what we need to do is in the database targets, we're going to erase this in the button database targets, and we're going to open a bracket because we're trying to make this dynamic, and then make use of backticks, and we are now going to set the ID to that's in uppercase. We're going to set the ID to the ID coming from Firebase, so that makes it dynamic. So we're going to do the same thing for our ID as well in our modal. So instead of this ID update task, we're gonna do this as well. So let's save and let's see if okay, this is gonna be without the ID, in fact. So let's save and refresh and see if we now have the right data. So when I click on the first one that says learn redux API, let's click on this. It says learn react. So each button now has its own modal which can be updated. So let me say learn react and Firebase. If I click on update task, it should get updated, as you can see. So the CRUD functionality now works. We're able to read data, we're able to add a new task, we're able to delete a task and update a task. So everything now works as far as the CRUD functionality is concerned. So the last thing we want to implement in this tutorial is the checked boolean we have right here. So to do that, we need to also make the checkbox persist and rule out any, probably you finish learning redux, anytime you click on learn redux it strikes it out. And then we also need to add the timestamp below the task. So let's quickly get into that. So to implement the checkbox, what we need to do is to create a function that helps us to track each of the specific checkbox when we click on it. For instance, when we go to the page and then we click on one of the specific checkbox, it helps us to track which particular checkbox we are clicking on. So to do that, we need to head straight to the input tag that contains the checkbox. So the first thing we need to do is, remember in the object we have, there is another field there called is checked. So I need to extract that as well because we want to first display the default value of the checkbox. So to do that, I'm just going to say make use of the default value attribute in React and then pass in the is checked value. So whether it is true or false, when the page loads, the checkbox would be checked or unchecked. The checkbox will be checked or unchecked depending on what is in the database. So next thing, I'm going to create an onChange event handler, and this is going to take in an event, and we'll also make use of the fat arrow, and we're going to create the function and call it checkbox handler. So I'm just going to call this checkbox handler, and we pass in the event parameter we created previously. And lastly, the last thing we need to do is to pass in the name attribute and give it the ID. So with this, we'll be able to track each of the specific checkbox. Now let's create the implementation above by creating the variable for this function. So I'm just going to say const checkbox handler is equals to, it's going to be asynchronous, so we make use of the async keyword, and then we pass in the event, and then make use of the fat arrow, open the bracket. So what I want to do next is to log the event ID into the console. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the console and then type in event.target.name. So I'm going to save this and then head straight to the browser, make sure the page is refreshed. So anytime I click on the checkbox, I expect the ID for the specific checkbox I click on to be locked in the console. So when I click on this, you can see we are able to log the ID for that particular clicked checkbox. So same thing applies to the second one. So we can now begin the implementation. So the first thing we want to do is to extract the ID, and to do that I need to be able to keep track of that, and that means we need to create a variable above by making use of this use state. So to do that, I'm just going to type in const checked, and then the setter is going to be set checked, and the use state is going to be an empty array by default. So I'm just going to grab this set checked and then head straight to our function we have right here, and then open the bracket. So the implementation for tracking the checkbox will be done inside of this bracket. So the first thing we need to do is to set a state variable and make use of the fat arrow, and then we can now create a variable that helps us to store the index we want to update. So I'm just going to say index is equals to, so I'm going to make use of the find index array method in JavaScript. So I'm just going to say state dot find index, and then we're now going to say checkbox, then dot id dot to string. So we're converting that specific ID to string if it's equals to the event.target.name. So what this means is when we click on the checkbox, we want to ensure we are clicking on the index of the checkbox among the array that was clicked. So once we are able to track that, the next thing we need to do is to set the new state of the array. So to do that, I'm just going to create a new variable called new state. So new state is going to be equals to state dot slice. So the state dot slice helps us to kind of create a clone of the array without changing the original array. So we can now say new state dot splice. The splice method in JavaScript does two things. It either helps us to remove an item from an array or helps to add an item to an array. It removes an item from an array when you have only 2 arguments, but it helps to add an item to an array when you have more than 2 arguments, that is 3 or more arguments. So in this case, so we are trying to add the object of the checkbox that was clicked to this new array. To do that, what I'm going to do is to pass in the index. So I'm just going to pass in the index, and then because we're adding just one item, I'm going to pass in 1, and then the object we want to add. So the object we want to add, we need to make a clone of it. So I'm going to make use of the spread operator for the variable called state, and then I'm going to pass in the index, and then the next thing I'll be doing is to pass in the is checked status, either it is true or false. So I'm just going to say is checked, and I'm going to pass not state, then the index dot is checked. So this helps us to track the object of the checkbox that was checked among the array. So with that, we can now return the new state. So outside of the bracket, I can just say return new state. So to be sure what we've done so far is correct, I think I have an error somewhere. Okay, I didn't add a comma somewhere here. So to be sure what we've done is correct, we are modifying the new array by returning this new state. So we can just pass in the set tags, which helps us to track all the array in the database, and then pass the new state to it. So we can now log the tags, the new state to the console. So I'm just going to pass in new state, and then this set tags above, which contains all the tags in the database, I'm going to log it in the console. So console.log tax. So I want to clear every other console log we have created previously. So I'm going to remove this one, and then in the edit tax component, I don't know if you have any console log here. Yeah, I'm going to remove this console log as well. I'm going to leave the ones for the error that only logs to the console when there's an error. So let me just save everything we've done so far, and then head straight to the browser and click on one of the checkboxes. So I'm going to click on the first one we have here. Okay, we have an error. The error says cannot read properties of undefined. Reading is checked on line 59. So I'm going to check line 59. So I think what's going on here is the error in the browser is telling us that none of the new states exists. The data does not exist. So I don't know where that could be coming from. Okay, let me add the optional chaining. Maybe that should solve the issue. So I'm going to refresh once more and then try it one more time. So I'm going to click on the first checkbox. Our data has disappeared, and it only returns the checkbox we have here, and it says true, but we no longer have data in on the page. So there's an issue somewhere. Yeah, I think there's an issue somewhere. We need to investigate that. Okay, I think I know what's going on. The set checked setter we have here doesn't contain any data, so we need to pass in the data when the page loads. So what we can do is to head straight to our use effect, and then right below the set tax, I can just pass in the tax data, which is coming from the Firebase Firestore, and then save. And with that, we have access to the data in the database, so we are able to modify the array from the database directly. So let me ensure the page is properly refreshed by reloading the page, and then hopefully this time around when we click on the checkbox, we see the newly modified state. So let me click on this drop down. As you can see, the first object in the array says the checked value is true, while the second one remains false. If I clear and then click on the second one, I believe both of them should return false. Should return true rather. So they are both true. And once again, let me uncheck them both, and I believe they should be false this time around. So this is the latest array. So as you can see, they are both false. What we want to do next is to now persist these checkbox results in the database, and to do that, we'll make use of something called run transaction in Firebase. So to persist the checkbox value in the database, the first thing I want us to do is to make use of the CSS that strikes through the particular text that was checked. So what I'm going to do is head straight to the index.css file, and right below the div checker, I can just create a class called done, and then I'm just going to create something called text decoration. I'm going to set the text decoration to line through. So this is going to strike out anything that was clicked in the checkbox. So when I head straight to the task component, I can just conditionally render the done class. First, before I do that, let me just pass in the done class by pasting it right here. So let me save everything we've done so far and then head straight to the browser. So you see that the entire text in the page, they are being striked out. So because the class is not yet dynamic, that's why we are not able to control it with the checkbox. So to do that, what we need to do is to make use of the is checked variable from the database to conditionally render the strike through coming from the CSS. So I'm just gonna remove these quotes, everything inside of this quote, and then make use of a bracket, and I'll make use of a backtick. So inside of the backtick, we can just make use of the $sign and then open a bracket. So we pass in the is checked value coming from the database, and we'll say if the checked value is equals to true, we want to render the done class by making use of the ternary operator. So I'm just gonna make use of the question mark there, then pass in the done class. If this checked value is true, then it renders the done class, else if it's not true, it doesn't render the done class rather. So that helps us to conditionally render the done class for the checkbox. And for now, I think the is checked values in database are set to false, so we can proceed by persisting the checked value in the database. So quickly, I'm just gonna create a comment here by saying persisting the checked value. So the first thing we're gonna do is to make use of the try catch block, because it's asynchronous by default. So we can just say catch error, And like we usually do, we're gonna console log the error. Instead of the try block, we're gonna extract the docref. So to do that, I'm gonna create a variable called docref. Docref is equals to, I'm gonna make use of the doc function in Firebase, which you've already imported previously. So it takes in 3 arguments. So the first one is the database configuration, the second one is the name of our collection, which is called tags, and finally it takes in the id, and we save that inside of the events.target.name. So now our docref is configured. Then we can now await our run transaction. So the run transaction, what it does basically is to help us write one data at a time to the database. What do I mean by that? If I head straight to the dashboard in our Cloud Firestore, we have two values right there, the is checked and the tax. We just want to use the checkbox to update the checked value. So instead of changing both values in the database by making use of the run transaction, we can just only change the checked value. That's the purpose of the run transaction. So I'm just gonna import that into our project right here. So run transaction has been imported above. To confirm, if I scroll up to the page, you can see we now have run transaction right here. So I go back to the bottom of the page and then we continue our implementation. So the run transaction also takes in some what's it called, it takes in some parameters as well. So the first one is the database configuration, and then it's also asynchronous in nature, so we need to pass in the async keyword, and then we can make use of the run transaction by opening a bracket and saying transaction, making use of the fat arrow, and then we can create a variable within it by saying const tax document, then await the transaction returned by making use of the get function and then passing in the docref. So that's the first step. So the next thing we need to do is to check if the document exists in the database. So first off, we handle if it does not exist. So if the document does not exist, so I'm gonna say if not tax doc dot exists. So if it doesn't exist, so we're gonna throw an error by making use of the throw keyword and say document does not exist. Oh, I didn't spell throw properly. And the next thing we need to do is now to complete our integration. That is, if the document does exist, then we can now create a variable called new value. That is the new value of our checkbox we want to send to the database. First we want to check if the document in the database is checked. So I'm gonna say if not stack docs dot data dot check dot is checked, then we can now make use of the update function to update the data in our database. So I'm just going to say transaction dot update, and then we pass in the docref, and then the is checked object. So I'm just going to say is checked, and then we pass in the new value which we created right here. So I'm just going to pass it here, and with that database is going to be updated successfully anytime we click on the checkbox. So we can probably return an alert message or probably log the successful transaction in the console. Let me just log it in the console and say tax checked successfully. And in the console you can just pass in a message as well and say failed to check tax. So we can save, and then let's try it out in the browser. So I'm just going to head straight to the browser, ensure the page is properly refreshed. So the first thing I'm going to do is to click on the first tax we have here. Once I click on this, you can see it gets checked, and if I head straight to the database, you see the database dynamically and at real time the is checked value is changed to true. If I do the same thing for the second tax we have here, you see that the value has been changed to true as well. That's why done class is rendering. If I change it to false, it also gets changed at real time directly in the database. So this is a very slick implementation. It now works properly. So we have 2 more implementations to do before we call it a day. The first one is to arrange the way our data is structured anytime we create a new task, because right now it renders randomly. If I create a new task, it might be probably in the middle of this task. I want it to be structured according to the time each of the tasks was created. So to do that, I'm going to head straight to the use effects. The use effect is where we are rendering our data and getting the data from the database. So right above the get tags variable, in fact within the get tags function variable, I can just create a new variable by saying const. I'm just going to call this q is equals to query, because to be able to restructure the way our data is rendering, we need to query the database. So I need to import this query from Firestore. So I'm just gonna do that as well, and then I'm gonna pass in the collection ref. So I'm gonna say collection ref, and then I'm gonna pass in the order by function as well, which we also need to import from the Firestore. And then I'm gonna pass in an argument called timestamp within it. So timestamp. So what I'm going to do is, instead of having collection ref right here, I'm just gonna grab this q variable, remove the collection ref in the get docs, and then pass in the q variable, which contains the order by, which contains the query for the rendering of the data according to the time each of the tasks was created. So what we can also do is, when adding the data to the database, we can pass in the timestamp as well. To do that, I'm just going to create a new key right here called timestamp. This has to tally with the keyword, the argument we pass into the order by, so which is timestamp, so it will reflect properly. So the timestamp is now going to take in something called server timestamp. This is also a function from Firebase. So with that, we're able to pass in the timestamp of each of the tasks. So I'm gonna save, and then before we test this out, I want to delete everything we have in the database. I want to delete our entire collection. So I'm going to click on this drop down we have here, and then I'm going to click on delete collection. Then I'm going to write in the name of our collection, click on delete. So this allows us to see our implementation from scratch, because the previous data we have here doesn't, the one we just deleted doesn't have any timestamp, but any data we now create now is going to have a timestamp. So let's create a task. So the first one I'm going to say is learn React, and then I'll click on the add task button. Then we can also learn Redux as well. Learn Redux. Click on the add task button to add our second task. And while that is being added, we can head straight to our dashboard and see our data. I'm going to refresh the database and see how it renders. As you can see, we now have a collection showing, and each of the collection now has a date and time. Each of them was created, as you can see in this timestamp key we have right here for the second task we created, which is learn React. You can see it also has a timestamp. So anytime we create a new task, a timestamp data is attached to it. So the final thing we need to do is to display the time right below each of the created tasks, so the user is aware of the time each of the tasks is being created. So quickly, let's head straight to our JSX, and we first need to extract the timestamp from our tags array. So to do that, right beside this is checked, I can just pass in timestamp as it appears in the database, and I think we can put it after the tags we are displaying here. So I'm just going to create a br tag, so br, and we can make it in italics. So I'm going to make use of the I tag, and I'm going to open a bracket, and we now make use of the JavaScript date object. So to do that, I'm just going to pass in the new keyword and then create a date, and inside of the date we are going to pass in the timestamp. We want to display the date and time, so I'm just going to pass in the seconds and then multiply it by 1000, and I'm going to say to local string. We have so many formats, so for this particular project I just want to make use of local string, and then I'll add a bracket to it, and then we can save and see how this looks on the page. Let's refresh. Beautiful. As you can see, we have the year as well as the time each of the tags was added. You can see the earlier tags is above and the later tags is below. If I add a new tags, is going to be at the bottom of the list. So let's say we want to learn JSX. So I'm going to add the tags, and then you see learn JSS appears at the bottom of the page along with the date and the time. So as you can see, it was created at this particular date and time. So you can see everything now works perfectly well. So that's it for today's video. So to quickly run through what we've done so far today, we can test out the functionalities once more. For the checkbox, let's say I select this particular checkbox and I refresh the page, you see that the data still persists when it's being returned from the database. It still remains checked. If I decide to delete probably the learn.jsx tags, you can see it's going to be deleted from the database. Then if I decide to update the tags, probably the learn redux tags, let's add a full stop to it and I click on update, it gets updated in the Firebase Firestore database. So that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed the tutorial, please make sure to like as well as subscribe, and you can also recommend my channel to other developers out there who are learning these types of technology. I believe it's going to be helpful to them, and I really appreciate that. And if you have questions and suggestions, do drop them in the comment section and I'll definitely engage with you. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one. Take care.